Thank you all for coming this evening. My name's Lisa Wade, and I'm with Plant-Based Advocates. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit organization. Our mission is to educate the public about the advantages of a plant-based diet, which are for the environment, health, animal welfare, and also social justice reasons. We're very active in our community. We do a lot of things like organize this monthly speaker series with the Los Gatos Library. We also do documentary screenings. We write articles for local newspapers. We do tabling and outreach, and we have served over 500 meals to unhoused members of our community during the pandemic. I'm so honored to introduce Dr. Ulka Agarwal from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. She is a board-certified psychiatrist and plant-based nutrition researcher. She's going to talk to us about how we can boost our mood with a plant-based diet, and I know that's a topic that's of interest to all of us, especially these days, so I'm so excited to introduce Dr. Agarwal.
So today we're going to answer these questions. How do plant-based diets affect physical health? And when I say plant-based diets, I mean a vegan diet. A diet with no animal products, no meat, no dairy, no eggs, no fish. If it's a vegetarian diet, then I'll specify that. And then how do plant-based diets affect mental health? So most of the research looking at plant-based diets and mental health is on depression. So I'm going to focus on depression. How do plant-based diets alter the brain and body? Meaning, what are the causes of depression? And what is it about plant foods that affect those causes of depression? And lastly, how do you adopt a plant-based diet for better mental health? Now in this talk, I'm going to use binary genders, male and female, only because that's the specific language used in the research that I'm quoting. And I'm going to be talking about mental health in adults today. I'd also like to recognize that there are important differences in disease risk amongst different racial and ethnic groups. For example, China, Japan, and India. They use a lower threshold to define obesity on the BMI or body mass index scale. And the reason is Asians and Asian Americans have a higher risk or have higher levels of body fat, and that puts them at risk for chronic illnesses. So for example, in the US, we use a body mass index or BMI of 30 to define obesity, but in Asian countries, they use 25 to 27. But because of the research I'm quoting today, we're going to be using the standard BMI scale. Okay, so how do plant-based diets affect physical health? Well, wait, why are we talking about physical health? We're all here to talk about mental health, right? So let's get to the good stuff. Because our minds and bodies don't work independently from each other, we need to understand how plant-based diets affect physical health, just like how they affect mental health. Because physical illnesses can increase risk for mental illnesses. For example, if you have diabetes, you have a higher risk for developing depression. And that's also why people often have physical illnesses along with mental illnesses. So to really understand how food affects our mental health, let's first look at how it affects our physical health. Let's start with a lesson from Japan. What is a traditional food staple in Japan? When you think of Japanese food, what is a food you think of? You can just yell it out.
Rice.
Yeah, rice is a traditional staple in Japan, and it contains a considerable amount of carbohydrates, right? But despite consuming a large amount of carbohydrates in the form of rice, before 1980, diabetes was rare in Japan, affecting only about 1 to 5% of adults over the age of 40. However, something changed in the Japanese diet around the time of 1980. Any idea what that was? Yeah, okay, this group is good. Western eating habits were introduced. So Japanese people were exposed to hamburgers, French fries, fried chicken, pizza, and other Western foods that were very different from their traditional meals. And so as Western food became more popular, the fat intake of the Japanese diet rose. And as fat intake rose, carbohydrate intake fell, because rice consumption was gradually replaced by these Western foods that were higher in fat. And as diets westernized, the prevalence of overweight increased markedly among men. For women, it stayed about the same or didn't increase as markedly. The reason is because women were likely not as exposed to foods served outside or around the work environment, and they were probably still eating more traditional Japanese meals. And so they weren't as exposed to all of the fat from the Western diets. So fat intake increased, carbohydrate intake decreased, And what do you think happened to the prevalence of diabetes? Yeah, it more than doubled. Yeah. So obviously, genetic traits didn't substantially change in this 10-year period. But what did change was a largely rice-based diet moved to a more westernized diet. Diet habits have changed in the US as well. So let's take a lesson from the US now. So the US Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, began tracking America's eating habits in 1909. And as you can see, meat consumption has steadily been rising since the 1940s. And this includes red meat, poultry, and fish. That's 195 pounds of meat per person per year. Can you guess what type of meat had the sharpest increase? Chicken intake has more than doubled per person per year since 1980. And Americans are now eating 1 million chickens every hour. So that means in the course of this talk, Americans will have eaten 1 million chickens. A lot of chickens. Cheese intake has risen nearly tenfold in the same time period. And if you can believe it, Americans are now eating 38 pounds of cheese per person per year. Sugar intake has increased in the US as well, in terms of total sweetener intake, and especially high fructose corn syrup. So our dietary habits have changed. What do you think has happened to diabetes prevalence in this country? You can only guess, right? So this graphic is from the Centers for Disease Control, or the CDC, and it shows the prevalence of diabetes in the US in 1994. Now, in the darkest blue states, that indicates more than 6% of the population in that state has diabetes, okay? And so as our diets change, here's what's happened to diabetes. So the darkest blue is 6% of people in that state have diabetes. And now in 2004, it's a switch to counties. And look how much diabetes has increased. The darkest blue went from 6% now to the range of 12 to 33%. So the darkest blue in these counties, 12 to 33% of people in those counties have diabetes. And now, 1 in 3 Americans either has diabetes or prediabetes. And how this relates to mental health? People with diabetes are 2 to 3 times more likely to have depression. We're also heavier than we've ever been. And that's concerning because obesity, and in particular visceral or belly fat, it acts like a biologically active organ. And so it secretes hormones and chemicals that cause inflammation throughout the body and the brain. And this inflammation increases our risk for chronic illnesses like heart disease, diabetes, and depression. As obesity and diabetes have increased, so has heart disease, accounting for 1 in every 4 deaths in the US. And it's the #1 cause of death in the US for men and women. Despite having the most advanced treatments we've ever had in medicine, we're sicker than we've ever been. So how did we get here? Well, part of the problem is that our own government is invested in the foods that can make us sick. So the USDA oversees what they call commodity programs, where they collect money from beef, pork, dairy, chicken, egg, and other animal product producers. And they use this money to market these animal products to all of us. So the USDA's main goal in these commodities is to increase each of our consumption of meat and dairy. So that's right, our own government has a vested interest in each of us eating more meat, dairy, and eggs. Foods that we know are high in cholesterol and saturated fat, and that increase our risk for heart disease, the #1 killer in this country. And to make matters worse, the USDA is also the same government agency that puts together the dietary guidelines for Americans. It's the main guide that tells us what to eat for our health. And it's the foundation of all federal food programs, including school lunches. So, on the one hand, the USDA has a vested interest in each of us eating more meat and dairy. And on the other hand, we trust them to give us advice about what to eat for our health. And these commodity programs have bipartisan support. So these checkoff programs are big money, and this is why. They're worth about $750 million per year. So what are they doing with all this money? Well, one way that they market these products is by creating catchy ads. Some that you are probably familiar with, like beef, it's what's for dinner, pork, the other white meat, and got milk. These checkoff programs that the USDA oversees also partner with food chains to increase meat and dairy intake. So for example, the dairy checkoff program partnered with Pizza Hut to launch new Detroit-style pizza. And the key here is that the commodity scientists worked with Pizza Hut to specifically engineer 50% more cheese into the crust of this pizza. Yet another way the USDA helps meat and dairy producers is that they subsidize these products. For example, they purchase meat and dairy for school lunches. The US federal government spends $38 billion a year, so that's $38 billion a year subsidizing meat and dairy, using our tax dollars to do that. And these subsidies also lower the price of meat and dairy for consumers so that we're more likely to buy them than other healthier products. And this creates even more health disparities for the most vulnerable Americans because they really can't afford to make more expensive choices. But yet another way that the USDA markets meat and dairy is through research grants, like this one for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where they're publishing their own papers about the health effects of meat and dairy, and this one in particular about how they affect mental health. And you can guess what their conclusions are from their research. So now that I've cheered everybody up, right? With all this conflicting information about nutrition, how do we get our health back on track? Well, one place to start is to study people who already follow a healthy lifestyle and see what can we learn from them, like the Seventh-day Adventists. So their religious teachings encourage a healthy lifestyle. So no alcohol, no tobacco, and no meat. So people follow this last recommendation to varying degrees. So they're actually a great group to study because we can actually look at the specific effects that meat have on health. So looking at the Adventist Health Study 2, this looked at data from over 60,000 participants, and they found the further people moved away from animal products, the lower their weight was. And the further they moved away from animal products, the less risk they had for type 2 diabetes. Similarly, a large European study found that obesity was less prevalent in vegetarian men and women than their meat-eating counterparts. And they also found that the further people moved away from animal products, the lower their cholesterol was, which we know is a major risk factor for heart disease. Another Seventh-day Adventist study found that vegetarian men have a 37.4% lower lifetime risk of ischemic heart disease, the cause of heart attacks. So, the further we move away from animal products, the lower our risk for obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. So remember this ad I showed you for Got Milk? It's Serena and Venus Williams, professional tennis players and sisters, and they did this ad in 1999. Well, about a decade later, Venus Williams started having fatigue and muscle and joint pain, and she was diagnosed with Sjogren's syndrome, which is an autoimmune disorder that has no cure. She had to drop out of the US Open that year, and she dropped out of the top 100 rankings. So since there's no cure, you often have to take multiple medications, and she didn't want to do that. So she decided to try a plant-based diet. And she says it reduced her inflammation, increased her energy, and improved her overall well-being. And she got back on the court a year later, and she went on to win 6 more titles. And now she markets her own plant-based protein shake, and she's still vegan. Okay, so we've seen how plant-based diets can reduce our risk for physical illnesses. Can they also reduce our risk for mental illnesses as well? Let's take a look. About 1 in 4 Americans has a diagnosed mental health disorder, and nearly 1 in 5 US adults has experienced depression. So despite having the most treatments we've ever had, the most medications we've ever had for depression especially, our mental health is reaching epidemic levels. And there are many reasons for this. Today we're going to look at how food affects mental health, and in particular, plant-based diets. So most of the research on plant-based diets and mental health is on depression, so I'm going to focus on depression. But mental health disorders are often related, and they occur together. So this research may extend to other mental illnesses like anxiety. And I want to make an important distinction that I'm looking at plant-based diets and the risk for developing depression, not plant-based diets and how they improve existing depression. There's very little data on that. There's still not as much data, but this is about reducing the risk for depression. This research here is from one of the most recent and comprehensive reviews or summaries of the research out there on vegetarian and vegan diets and depression. And as you can see, for vegetarian diets and depression, there was a pool of just 21 studies. So not much out there, but it's growing. So far, there's about 7 of those studies were associated with a decreased risk of depression, 8 with an increased risk, and 6 with no association. So really looking at the data, we can't tell much from this. And the reason is because vegetarian diets vary in definition. So they often include eggs, dairy, or even fish, and various combinations of those. So it can be kind of hard to study vegetarian diets. And though there are far fewer studies looking at vegan diets, so no animal products and depression, it's a little more encouraging. So just 4 studies, but 3 of them were associated with a decreased risk of depression and 1 with an increased risk, and none with no association. So it looks like from this early data, perhaps vegan diets can reduce risk for depression, but we need more data to support this. We just don't have the research yet. But despite this research, there's a persistent misconception amongst researchers and the general public that plant-based diets can cause depression. So why does this misconception persist? Well, for those who follow a vegan diet, has anyone ever asked you, where do you get your protein? Well, some researchers don't even know that answer. And so they assume that plant-based diets are low in protein and they're deficient in other nutrients as well. As you can see how they put in their conclusion, they may not be able to meet recommended dietary allowances for nutrients. Most of these researchers don't measure nutrient levels in the blood or the intake of these nutrients. They're just assuming that people are deficient in these nutrients when they're following a plant-based diet. Let's see what the research actually says about plant-based diets and nutrient deficiencies. When you look at large reviews or summaries of plant-based diets and nutritional status, here's what you find. So those following a plant-based diets tend to have lower intakes of protein, but they meet dietary recommendations. So in general, protein intake is adequate. And actually protein deficiency, it's virtually unheard of in the US. And that's because it's related to caloric intake. So if you're getting enough calories, you're getting enough protein. So if someone has low protein or they're worried about not getting enough protein, they're probably not getting enough calories, regardless of whether their diet includes meat or not. In fact, most Americans get twice as much protein as they need. And in fact, in the dietary guidelines for Americans, remember, brought to you by the USDA, the folks who want you to eat more meat and dairy, even they say that adult and teen men are eating too much protein. And they do generally eat more animal protein than their female counterparts. Well, so why is too much protein bad? Animal protein is linked to heart disease and to early death caused by diabetes and cancer and other chronic illnesses. Okay, so protein deficiency isn't a reason. For those following a plant-based diet, they're at no greater risk for iron deficiency or iron deficiency anemia when compared to their meat-eating counterparts. Now, for vitamin B12, they have adequate blood levels when taking a supplement, right? And so when following a plant-based diet, taking a B12 supplement is always advised. And that's because B12 is not produced by plants or animals, it's produced by bacteria, exactly. And in the past, perhaps the B12 was present in the soil where our produce was grown, but now with pesticides and washing our produce so vigorously, plant foods are no longer a reliable source of B12. And then those following a plant-based diets tend to have higher blood levels than their meat-eating counterparts for folate. They are more likely to have lower blood levels of zinc, but these lower blood levels do not extend to any known clinical relevance, no adverse health effects, and they're not at greater risk for deficiency than their meat-eating counterparts. Those following a plant-based diet also have adequate blood levels of magnesium, and though they may have lower blood levels of some vitamin D markers, their levels are adequate and they're no greater risk for deficiency than their meat-eating counterparts. Omega-3, so those following a plant-based diet are more likely to have lower blood levels of omega-3 than their meat-eating counterparts, but this also doesn't extend to any adverse health effects. And people with lower omega-3 intake have actually been found to have better moods than those with a higher omega-3 intake. So omega-3 is a common nutritional approach like fish oil or algae oil, for treating depression. And that's because of the anti-inflammatory effects and other positive effects on the brain. But when you look at the whole body of research on this, it's actually inconclusive on whether omega-3 supplementation can actually improve symptoms of depression. And that includes fish oil and plant-based sources like algae oil. And that's because there's so much variation in the source and dose and frequency of omega-3 oils that it's hard to draw any real conclusions. In general, research doesn't really support taking a nutritional supplement for depression unless you have a known deficiency, except of course for B12, right, if you're following a plant-based diet. But of course, many of us take nutritional supplements even without a deficiency. So if you're taking a nutritional supplement and you feel like it's been helpful, it's not causing any bad effects, and it's affordable, it seems reasonable to continue it. But keep in mind that supplements are not FDA approved, so you don't have a guarantee of exactly what's in it or what's not in it, like heavy metals. So you want to research them carefully and purchase them from a reliable source. You also want to let your medical provider know that you're taking supplements because they can worsen some medical conditions and interact with prescription medications. So research shows that well-balanced plant-based diets provide adequate nutrition when a B12 supplement is taken. Of course, any diet that's not well-balanced can cause nutrition deficiencies, even those that include meat. Another assumption they make is that people adopt a plant-based diet first and then become depressed. But they don't actually look at the temporal relationship between adopting a plant-based diet and depression. There are 3 studies that have looked at this relationship. One study found that depression preceded the adoption of vegetarian diet by 6 years. That means people were depressed for at least 6 years, or an average of 6 years, before they decided to adopt a vegetarian diet. Another study found that depressed women were more likely to adopt a vegetarian diet. And then the third study didn't find any association. So more research is needed, but it seems at least some research suggests that people are depressed first and then they're adopting a plant-based diet. Can anyone guess why that might be? Because they hear plant-based diets are healthy, right? They might have some chronic illnesses as well, and they think, I want to follow a healthy lifestyle, maybe this will help as well. So since we don't have as much data as we'd like on plant-based diets and depression, let's expand out beyond plant-based diets to all food and all diets in general and their effect on the risk for depression. And by doing this, we can start to see some trends on which foods tend to decrease the risk for depression and which foods tend to increase the risk for depression. So when we look at the data, foods that follow a Mediterranean diet pattern and predominantly a plant-based Mediterranean diet pattern, including fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and by legumes I mean beans and lentils, grains, including whole grains, and healthy fats, these all tend to be associated with a decreased risk for depression. What else do all these foods tend to have in common? Mostly plant-based, right? When we look at foods that increase risk for depression, can you guess what those foods might be? And I didn't skew this is from the research. Those that have a pro-inflammatory diet pattern. So meat, including poultry, red meat, processed meat, dairy, low and high fat, eggs, animal protein in general, saturated fat, cholesterol, trans fats, and then processed foods. And so when we look at the foods that tend to increase risk for depression, we can see that they're mostly animal-based. I added fish at the end because fish and other seafood have been associated with an increased risk for depression and a decreased risk for depression. And this is likely because fish has good healthy fats like omega-3, but it's also an animal protein, and it has saturated fat and cholesterol, which we can see are all associated with an increased risk for depression. As we can see, plant-based diets are plentiful in the foods that have been associated with a decreased risk for depression. All right, so how do plant-based diets alter the body and brain? So we saw that the foods associated with a decreased risk for depression are the same foods that are plentiful in plant-based diets. But what is it about these plant-based foods that may be decreasing the risk for depression? Well, here's a hint. How much fiber do animal foods have? 0. None, right? because this is a really good crowd. Okay, you guys know your stuff. Right, so plants are the only source of fiber in our diet. Plants are also high in antioxidants, like vitamin C and beta carotene. And we don't fully understand what exactly causes depression, but there are some proposed causes. And one proposed cause of depression is inflammation. Now, short-term or acute inflammation is a normal part of the body's immune response and healing process. Like if you fall and hurt your knee, right? Protective cells rush to the injury site and it becomes red and swollen. And this is a healing form of inflammation. But when inflammation is long-term and chronic, it can cause your body and brain to malfunction. And this can lead to diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and depression. Another proposed cause of depression is called oxidative stress, which is caused by harmful molecules called free radicals in the body. And they damage cells, including your DNA. Well, when we follow a plant-based diet that's high in fiber and antioxidants, the fiber and antioxidants act as a prebiotic or food for the good bacteria in our guts. It increases the amount of good bacteria and the different strains and types of good bacteria called bacterial diversity. And these two things have been associated with less inflammation, cell repair, and better mood. Animal foods, on the other hand, contain arachidonic acid, which is a pro-inflammatory fat that has been associated with anxiety, stress, and depression. So we see that the fiber and antioxidants in plant foods reduce inflammation and repair damaged cells, which can promote a better mood. Another proposed cause of depression is low neurotransmitters, which are chemicals in the brain used to communicate throughout the body and in the brain itself. So everyone's heard of serotonin, the happy neurotransmitter, right? So serotonin is a neurotransmitter that's important in mental health because it regulates things like our feelings of happiness. But if we have less serotonin or low serotonin in the brain, we can feel more sad. And if we have more serotonin in the brain, we can feel more happy. Okay, well, how do we get this serotonin? Well, the brain makes serotonin from an amino acid called tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid which kind of helps us build protein in our bodies. We get tryptophan from the food we eat. So we eat food, we get the tryptophan, it makes serotonin, which helps us feel happier. When you think of tryptophan, what food do you think of?
Turkey.
Turkey, right? But that's actually a misconception that turkey is a good source of tryptophan, because the high content or the high protein content of meat actually makes it harder for tryptophan to enter the brain. So it's harder for tryptophan to enter the brain, so you effectively have less serotonin available in the brain. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, they make it easier for tryptophan to enter the brain. And so you can effectively have higher levels of serotonin. And this might explain why when we're feeling sad or down, we crave carbs, right? Our brain knows that we're going to get more serotonin that way. We don't crave turkey. So a diet high in animal protein can limit serotonin production. And a healthy way to ensure that the brain receives all the serotonin it needs is to eat foods like beans and lentils, which are high in complex carbohydrates and in protein. And there are many other plant-based sources of tryptophan as well. Okay, so in addition, plant foods contain an antioxidant called quercetin. And this antioxidant blocks the breakdown of serotonin. So effectively, you have more serotonin available in the brain. So we've learned that plant foods can increase the amount of tryptophan in the brain, which increases the production of serotonin. And we've learned that plant foods are the only source of an antioxidant called quercetin that blocks the breakdown of serotonin in the brain, also increasing the levels of serotonin. Another way plant-based diets might affect depression is by reducing risk for physical illnesses. So, we talked about physical illnesses can increase the risk for mental illnesses like depression. So if a plant-based diet can reduce the risk for physical illnesses, then they can indirectly reduce the risk for mental illnesses. But we need more research to fully understand this connection between plant-based diets and depression. For those who don't know, PCRM is a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C. that conducts research on the effects of plant-based diets and chronic illnesses, and they also advocate for ethical research. So I no longer work there, but I did work there before, and I was the director of clinical research. Our team wanted to study how a plant-based diet affects obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and mental health. All right, anyone know who this gecko is? Geico, that's right. So the Geico headquarters are located just down the street from the PCRM office in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And so our team decided to invite Geico to join the study. And not only did their employees in the Chevy Chase office join our study, so did 9 other sites across the country. So 10 different Geico sites joined this study. So we split these 10 sites into 2 groups. One group followed the plant-based diet or the vegan diet, and the other group continued to eat a mixed diet including animal products. And we did this so that we could compare the effects of the plant-based diet and those of the mixed diet on different health effects. So what did the plant-based group eat? Well, they followed a vegan diet, so no animal products. They kept the oils low, tried to eat more whole foods rather than processed foods, so more whole grains. Everybody took a B12 supplement. They had weekly nutrition classes, but they didn't have to count calories and they didn't count carbs because plant-based foods are already naturally lower in calories, and then they watched their fat content. And the study was for 18 weeks. So low-fat vegan, what did they eat, right? Well, they ate foods like this for breakfast, foods like this for lunch and snacks, and dinners like this. Anybody getting hungry? It's dinner time. And they ate like this for 18 weeks, and here's what we found. In the vegan or plant-based group, they lost, after 18 weeks, an average of 10 pounds. Those eating the mixed diet with animal products lost less than half a pound in 18 weeks. Those in the plant-based group, their hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of the average blood sugar over 3 months, it fell 0.74 percentage points. And to put that into perspective, that's enough for someone in the 18-week study to completely reverse their diabetes and get off medication. Those in the mixed diet lost 0.1 percentage points, which is insignificant. Those in the plant-based group, their total and LDL cholesterol also fell significantly, which we know is a major risk factor for heart disease. But their physical health didn't just improve, so did their emotional well-being across the board. And when we look at symptoms specific to depression, like depression, anxiety is often a part of depression, fatigue, emotional well-being, these all decreased significantly in the vegan group compared to the mixed diet. So depression, as many people know, can cause a lack of energy, low motivation, sluggishness, cognitive impairment like feeling foggy, and difficult making decisions, which all affects one's productivity. But we found in the vegan group that their productivity increased significantly compared to the mixed diet, both at work and at home. Okay, well, what about the nutrition deficiencies that researchers are always assuming are low and causing depression? In our study, protein, iron, B12, omega-3, zinc, folate, and magnesium were all adequate and within the dietary requirements. And as you can see, protein decreased, but again, like we talked about, protein is related to calorie intake, and that's why those in the plant-based diet lost weight, because their calorie intake went down as well. So the protein decreased, but was well within the adequate amounts. Cholesterol, sorry for the back and forth, it's because of the scale, but cholesterol and saturated fat both decreased, which we know are linked to increased risk for depression. Fiber increased significantly, which we know is linked to decreased inflammation. Carbohydrates increased significantly, which we know is linked to higher serotonin. And 2 antioxidants, vitamin C and beta-carotene, increased significantly, which we know reduce inflammation and can also reduce oxidative stress, 2 proposed causes of depression. I'd like to tell you a little bit about 2 participants in this study, Hillary and Bruce. Hillary and Bruce were the youngest participants in our study. They were a couple and they worked at Geico together. Hillary weighed 240 pounds Bruce's total cholesterol was 270, and his doctor was about to start him on medications in his late 20s and 30s. So they were excited to be chosen to be in the vegan group and attend the classes. But after each class, week after week, their instructor would come back and tell the group that Bruce and Hillary are just chit-chatting throughout the classes. We don't think they're going to make it, right? And so we thought, okay, well, maybe they won't make it. But later we learned that they actually weren't just chit-chatting. They were trying to figure out how were they going to have a plant-based Thanksgiving and holiday with their families. They were trying to figure out how could they follow this plant-based diet and integrate it into their lives well beyond this 18-week study. And about 6 months later, they sent us this photo. They eventually lost a combined 185 pounds. Bruce's cholesterol fell to 150, and he no longer had to be on medication. But it wasn't just their physical health that benefited. Hillary said it really boosted her confidence, and she said it led her to getting 3 promotions in the following year. Bruce said we're more positive and things feel more possible. And they actually ran their first half marathon, and this is a picture from that. They both eventually left Geico and went on to graduate school. So these kinds of results, may not be typical for everybody who follows a plant-based diet, but for Bruce and Hillary, it was life-changing both physically and mentally. They have a YouTube video that you can watch and learn a little bit more about their story. So we've learned plant-based diets and depression. There's no evidence that plant-based diets cause depression. Research suggests individuals may actually be adopting a plant-based diet to treat their existing depression. And plant-based diets are plentiful in the foods that have been associated with a decreased risk for depression. Okay, so how do we adopt a plant-based diet for better mental health, right? Well, the key is if you have mental health issues, it's important to seek care or work with your primary care doctor or a mental health practitioner, because we just don't have enough research right now to say plant-based diets can prevent or treat mental illnesses. So it's important to seek treatments that we know are evidence-based, like medications, therapy, and procedures if those are indicated for you. And the best way to use a plant-based diet for mental health is to add it to existing treatment, like adjunct treatment, and aim for better health and wellness. Wellness is an intrinsic quality that helps us build resilience. It helps us grow and flourish in life. And healthy habits like plant-based diets, good sleep, exercise, stress management, mindfulness, and a sense of belonging or community like the one we have here all really nurture a sense of wellness. And this sense of wellness can help us mitigate and even prevent physical and mental illnesses. So what about those folks who say, yeah, I tried a plant-based diet and I felt worse? Because I do hear this. Well, here are some reasons why that might be. So first, any diet pattern can make you feel worse if it's not balanced, even if it contains meat. Of course, Diet Coke and Oreos are vegan, right? But they don't make for a healthful, balanced diet. So a good rule of thumb is to try to make your plate look like this for every meal, or as close as possible. So equal parts fruits, vegetables, beans and lentils, and grains, and preferably whole grains. This ensures you get enough calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals. Except B12 like we talked about, right? So there are fortified foods like breakfast cereals and nutritional yeast and plant milks, but it's better to have a more reliable form of a B12 supplement in the form of a pill. It can be cyano or methylcobalamin. You only need 2.4 micrograms a day. You don't need much, so find the bottle with the smallest amount and just take one a day. Eat the rainbow. Next, make your plate as colorful as possible and try to include all the colors of the rainbow because each color contains its own health-boosting antioxidants. For example, orange carrots have beta-carotene and yellow lemons have vitamin C. And have you noticed when you order a plant-based meal, everybody wants a bite of yours, right? Even the meat eaters? That's because well-balanced plant-based meals are beautiful. And I think this was Mother Nature's intention all along, to attract us to the foods that are the most healthful for us. Choose whole foods. Well, we hear this a lot, but what do we mean by whole foods? Food in its most natural state. So instead of processed versions like applesauce or apple pie, eat the apple itself. And this is important because when you eat foods in their most natural state, you get all the nutritional benefits like fiber, water, vitamins and minerals. Otherwise, you're just left with concentrated amounts of salt, sugar, and fat. Okay, but an apple over apple pie, not going to happen, right? Even after a talk like this, and we know what's good for us. But it's not our fault that we struggle with making healthy choices, and here's why. And Dr. Doug Lisle, who's a psychologist and wrote the book, The Pleasure Trap, put together this really amazing graphic. So this is his genius. But in phase 1, as babies, we're introduced to whole natural foods. What do we eat? Boiled, steamed, mashed veggies and fruit, right? And this is kind of naturally what we're supposed to eat. You know, for the most part, we enjoy it, right? But in phase 2, as we get older, we get introduced to junk food or processed food. And these foods are essentially concentrated amounts of salt, sugar, oil, cheese, meat, and fat. And they're rich and calorie dense. And rich calorie dense foods boost the amount of dopamine in our brains that makes us feel good. In fact, food scientists specifically engineer food to have the exact proportions and amounts of fat, salt, cheese that they know are going to boost the most dopamine in our brains. It's all a science. But whenever we have a really high stimulus, our brain gets used to it and it becomes dulled or adapted to it. And so even though we're eating rich, calorie-dense foods, we're not getting as much reward for them. The dopamine's not hitting as high. So this is called habituation. So it's like when you walk into someone's house during the holidays and they have a live Christmas tree and it smells really good for the first 10, 15 minutes, and then you kind of get used to it. That's what happens in your brain. And that's what's happening in phase 3. Okay, so now we've habituated to this rich, calorie-dense food, and we're getting about the same amount of pleasure as we always got from food, except now the food's unhealthy for us. And now we're developing obesity, diabetes, heart disease, maybe even depression. And then we come to a talk like this, and we get inspired, and we know what we need to eat, and then we still can't make the right choices. And here's why we can't do that. Because when we reintroduce whole foods, our brain tells us the right thing to eat is wrong, right? It wants to go back to here, not down to here. The reason why our brain thinks that these are the wrong foods is because food like sugar, cheese, and meat trigger the release of opiates, about 1/10 of the potency of morphine. And so when we stop eating these foods, we are literally going through drug withdrawal. In fact, drugs that block morphine and heroin also block the appeal for meat and cheese when they've done this in research studies. So it can take several weeks to readapt our brain back to these healthy foods so that we get the same amount of pleasure from healthful whole foods. But it's these several weeks that are really tough. And to get through those, it's important to have a buddy or support system or a community like this one. So part of drug withdrawal is cravings, right? And the key is to power through the cravings. So there are many strategies. Find the ones that work for you. Some of them are wait 10 minutes or have a distraction, say, okay, I want that donut, but I gotta wait 10 minutes and then see if I still want it. And sometimes the craving goes away. Or the apple test, right? Okay, well, before I eat a donut, I have to eat an apple. And if I still want the donut, maybe I'll wait 10 minutes and then see if I still want it. And another is to weigh the immediate pleasure with the long-term benefits. You know, is this immediate pleasure gonna promote my long-term well-being? And finally, some keys to success. Adopt a plant-based diet for lifelong wellness, rather than a specific goal like weight loss, so you can really enjoy the journey and not just kind of hold your breath for the destination. So allow room for imperfection. Meet yourself wherever you are in the process and celebrate even the smallest steps because they all really matter. And have fun. Find a community like this one. Find a friend or family member who wants to try a plant-based diet with you. Try new recipes and flavors, and you never know who you might be inspiring. Thank you.